All right, hi. This is the second lecture video for this week, right? And now we're going to be turning to central argument for this week, Anselm's ontological argument, right? And this is an argument for the existence of God. So maybe by way of sort of stage setting, let's sort of think about the last video. So in the last video, we looked at the Barber paradox, right? And we noted that this was a reductio ad absurdum argument, right? We explained what that meant. So that's all by way of stage setting, right? So Anselm's ontological argument is itself a reductio ad absurdum argument, right? It's an argument for the existence of God. All right, there are a bunch of different arguments for the existence of God. That's, I take it, unsurprising because, well, people care about whether or not God exists, right? So on the one hand, theists care, right? People who believe in the existence of God care, right? Because many of these people build their lives around it, right? Or structure their lives around it, or their social lives, or whatever, right? On the other hand, atheists, right? People who don't believe in the existence of God, uh, care about this as well, right? They are presumably invested in the fact that God doesn't exist, right? So they need to say something about these arguments for the existence of God. They need to show why they're not good arguments. And then, of course, there are people who are like agnostic, right? Who don't know whether or not God exists, right? They have no belief one way or the other, right? Maybe they suspend judgment, right? Maybe you're one of these people as well, right? And you should care, I take it, whether or not God exists, right? You should care about these arguments for the existence of God, right? Um, okay, but why? I guess why care whether or not God exists? Um, in some ways, that's a tough question, right? I can't like convince you to care, right? But maybe here's some things that we could say, right? So, um, I don't know if God exists, right? And God is anything like in the Abrahamic religions, right? Then God created like the heavens and the earth. God created you. God cares about you, right? These seem to be reasons to care whether or not God exists. Okay, so sort of unsurprisingly, there have been a bunch of arguments for the existence of God, right? So one broad class of arguments are called design arguments, right, or arguments from design. So these arguments purport to show that God exists on the basis of some sort of perceived design in nature, right? So perhaps, look, the world just appears to be too intricate to have arisen by chance, right? It shows evidence of craftsmanship, right? Who is this craftsman? Well, it's God, right? So that's a sort of design argument in a nutshell. There are also these arguments that are called cosmological arguments, right? And they're arguments like the following, right? Every event uh, has a cause, right? Or it appears that every event has a cause. Well, the causes couldn't have gone back to like infinity, right? So there must have been a first cause. That first cause is God. And then finally, we have what we'll call ontological arguments. And this is the sort of argument we're going to be looking at today. And these arguments purport to show that God exists simply on the basis of facts about the concept of God. Right, so I think these are the more interesting arguments. Okay, so the ontological argument that we're going to be looking at today comes from St. Anselm. He was a Benedictine monk. He was Italian. He's the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he lived from 1033 to 1109. So this argument is part of a larger work. We won't be looking at that, but it's interesting if people want to check it out. Okay, so Anselm's ontological argument purports to show that God exists. It purports to show that God exists purely on the basis of reflection on the concept of God. So this is kind of cool, I think, right? So the thought is, if we understand the concept of God, right, then we can't but conclude that God exists. Okay, to see if the argument works, right, we're going to have to analyze the concept of God. That's a big task, right? We've analyzed concepts before, so why don't we start with some simpler concepts? So here's one of our first examples, right? What's it to be a bachelor? So remember we worked through this before, but let's see what you can come up with. Here's I think a good stab at analyzing the concept bachelor. A bachelor is a single unmarried male who's marriageable, right? So anything that's single, unmarried, male, and marriageable is a bachelor. Anything that isn't a bachelor. So um, so good. Reflect on your own case, right? Do you satisfy this concept? If you do, you're a bachelor. If you don't, you're not. Okay, so some of the concepts that we have that we've analyzed, like bachelor, right, we can analyze them just on the basis of our command of the English language, right, or whatever language. In this case, we're speaking English, so we'll do English. But other concepts aren't like that, right? So consider, what's it to be president of the United States, right? What does something have to be like in order to be president of the United States? Well, if I guess if you know your Constitution inside and out, you could have come up with this. But here's what the Constitution says: no person except a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible to the office of president. Neither shall any person be eligible to that office who shall not have attained to the age of 35 years and been 14 years a resident within the United States. Okay, so just by like your command of the English language, you couldn't have told me what it is to be president of the United States or what that concept means or what that concept is. Um, but you know, if you go out into the world and investigate, you can figure out what's required, right? You didn't have to look at the United States Constitution. Okay, so we've analyzed two concepts, that of bachelor and that of president of the United States. Now, by analyzing those concepts, do we know whether there are any bachelors or presidents of the United States? That is, just by knowing what the concepts mean, can you tell whether there are any bachelors or presidents of the United States? Okay, well, before we get into that, right, note that there are bachelors and presidents of the United States. You know that, right? But how did you figure that out, or how did you come to know that? Well, it wasn't just by reflecting on the meaning of the concepts, right? Reflecting on the concepts. You had to like know something about the world, independent of the concepts, right? So in the case of bachelors, right, you needed to know that there was someone who was a single male, unmarried person of marriageable, who's marriageable, right? You couldn't just focus on the concept and tell me whether there are bachelors. Right? You had to know something about the people in the world. Similarly, for presidents of the United States, right? You couldn't just like look at the definition in the Constitution and tell us whether there were presidents, right? There's this question about whether anything is picked out by the concept, right? So think back to Vulcan, right? The planet Vulcan when we were talking about the self, right? We said what that concept was supposed to mean, but there was this question about whether there was anything that satisfied the concept. That is, whether the planet Vulcan existed. Right, to figure that out, you had to like look through your telescope, right, and go out into the world and investigate. You couldn't tell just on the basis of the concept. Right? So to say whether there are any bachelors, for instance, you had to know something about the world. Namely, you had to know that so and so, some particular person, is a single unmarried male who's marriageable. And in the case of presidents of the United States, you needed to know that so and so satisfies the Constitution's requirements for being president of the United States. Right. So the important point here is that for these concepts, you couldn't just figure out that things satisfied them by thinking about it. You needed to investigate the world around you. You needed to know something about like what's out there and what it's like. Okay, so we can think about other concepts. Right? Does anyone in this class satisfy the concept person over 7 feet tall? Well, here again, you know what this concept means, right? We don't really need to analyze it. And if we did, I don't know that we could do it in sort of simpler terms. But is there anyone in this class who satisfies the concept person over 7 feet tall? Well, you can't look around, unfortunately, but you've been in class and you've seen people stand up, and what do you know? No one is over 7 feet tall in this class, so no one satisfies that concept. Okay, so here are some important points so far. So some concepts pick something out. For instance, bachelor or president of the United States. There are things that satisfy those concepts. On the other hand, some concepts don't pick anything out. So for instance, the self, according to Buddhists, right? A person over 7 feet tall taking this class. Right? These concepts are meaningful, but they don't pick anything out. They don't correspond to anything. Nothing satisfies them. Or so says the Buddhist, right? In the case of the self. But note that in both cases, right, if we wanted to tell whether or not anything satisfied those concepts, we couldn't just think about it. Right? We had to go out into the world and look around. Right? We couldn't tell whether or not there was a person over 7 feet tall taking this class unless we looked. Right? We couldn't tell that there was no self without looking, according to the Buddhist. Right? We couldn't tell that there were bachelors without looking, and we couldn't tell that there were presidents of the United States without looking. Okay. So let's go back to the concept of God. Okay, so here's what Anselm is going to be up to. He's going to argue that the concept of God is different than those concepts we've just looked at. Right? He's going to argue that we can tell whether something satisfies the concept of God just by thinking about the concept. He thinks that we don't need to investigate the world. All we need to do is think about the concept. So in some ways, this is significant, right? I've already looked at some of the journals that people came up with, and people say things like there's no evidence one way or the other whether God exists. Right? I take it what people mean by this isn't that there's no evidence whatsoever. It's just that we couldn't go out into the world and tell. Right? All of the things that we observe, I take these people to be saying, are consistent with the hypothesis that God exists, and also consistent with the hypothesis that God doesn't exist. Right? And you might think that those hypotheses are equally likely given the evidence. Right, so the sort of thought maybe that people are having in the background, right, is that we can't investigate the world, right, to tell whether or not God exists. If we're going to figure out whether God exists, we need some other sort of method, right? And perhaps Anselm's ontological argument, right, which argues that we can tell whether God exists just by thinking about the concept, right, is that something else that we need. Okay, so we've analyzed some concepts. Let's try to analyze the concept of God. Whew. So normally in the classroom, right, we would have a long discussion about this, right, where you folks supply ideas and we sort of talk about them. Unfortunately, we can't do that here. But I want you to take a moment and try to answer this question. What do you think should be included in this concept? Right? Importantly, to answer this question, right, you don't have to believe that God exists. Right? I'm just asking, what would God be like if God existed? Right? And you can answer that question even if you don't believe in God, right? So consider Pegasus, right? That winged horse from Greek mythology. What would that thing be like if it existed? Well, presumably it would, have wings and be horse-like? Right? Maybe white? I don't know what color Pegasus is supposed to be. Maybe white. But importantly, you can answer that question without thinking that Pegasus does in fact exist. Right, so similarly, you can answer this question: what would God be like if God existed, without believing that God existed? Okay, so pause the video for a moment and ask yourself and try to answer, right? What do you think should be included in this concept, the concept of God? So what I'm going to do now is try to outline some big parts of the argument, right? So analyzing the concept of God, Anselm tells us that he thinks that the concept of God is the concept of a greatest conceivable being, or a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. right? So the greatest conceivable being is supposed to be like the top, right? Nothing is better than the greatest conceivable being. Right? God is supposed to be the greatest thing that anyone could ever conceive or imagine. Right? Nothing's better than God. That's the idea. So sometimes people talk about God being omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omnipresent. So omnipotent, all powerful, omnibenevolent, all knowing or all good, right? Omnipresent, all present, present everywhere, omniscient, right? All knowing, right? If God is like all of these things, it's not as though anything could be better, right? Anything like that would just be God. Okay, so here are three big ideas to keep in mind as we go through this. First, Anselm argues that God exists, right? Second, Anselm argues that we can tell whether God exists just by thinking about the concept. Right? And third, Anselm tells us that the concept of God is the greatest conceivable being, or we'll abbreviate this GCB. Okay, so here's the big question for us to consider. Does anything satisfy the concept GCB, greatest conceivable being? Right? If it does, then God exists. If it doesn't, then God doesn't exist. Right? Think about Vulcan again. If anything satisfies this concept, planet between Mercury and the Sun that explains the oddities of Mercury's orbit, then Vulcan exists. If nothing satisfies that concept, then Vulcan doesn't exist. Okay, so we're going to start the ontological argument. And we're just going to go through the passage sort of line by line, right, and talk about what's going on in it. So first, the passage opens up with this. This is Anselm writing. Right? Truly there is a God, although the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Right? So Anselm is telling us that he thinks that there's a God, even though there's this person, the fool, the atheist, right, who thinks that God doesn't exist. Okay. And then Anselm continues with a sort of like prayer, right? And so, Lord, do you, who do give understanding to faith, give me, Anselm, so far as you knowest it to be profitable, right? So far as God thinks it would be good for Anselm to think about this, understand that you are as we believe, right? That you're the greatest conceivable being, and that you are that which we believe. And indeed, we believe that you are a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Or, as the fool says, is there no such nature, since the fool has said in his heart, there is no God? Okay, so this is the start of the passage. What's going on here? Well, sort of in the beginning, right? Anselm tells us that he thinks there's a God, even though some people disagree with him. The atheist, the fool. Right? The fool, the atheist says there's no God. Right? This comes from the Bible, Psalm 14, verse 1. Right? This quotation, there is no God. The fool has said in his heart that there is no God. Okay, so Anselm's put his cards on the table right in the beginning. He thinks there's a God, right? Even though people disagree with him. Right? And then he asks God for understanding, right? So that he can like write this argument that he's about to write. Okay, and he tells us that he thinks God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? Or the GTB. Right? And then he asks, well, is there no such nature, since the fool has said in his heart there is no God? Right? So he's going to consider this question, does God exist? Right? Why is it an interesting question? Well, in part because there are people who disagree about it. Right? The fool, the atheist, says that God doesn't exist. So Anselm wants to know what to believe and on what basis. Right? So here's the part of the passage that's especially important for our purposes. Right? This is where Anselm tells us that he thinks that God, the concept God, right, is to be analyzed as a being in which nothing greater can be conceived, or greatest conceivable being, GCB. Right. People should follow up these little parenthetical references. So here's the quotation from the Bible. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. They're corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good. Okay, so the opponent here is who Anselm calls the fool, that is the atheist. Okay, in your own papers, probably don't call your opponent a fool, right? Um, anyway, so the passage continues. But, at any rate, this very fool, the atheist, when he hears of this being of which I speak, a being in which nothing greater can be conceived, understands what he hears, and what he understands is in its understanding, although he does not understand it to exist in reality. Okay, so what's going on here? So pause the video, take a moment to figure this out, or think about it. Okay, so one thing that's really important here is that Anselm is drawing a distinction, right, between existing in the understanding and existing in reality. Okay. So I take it we know what it is to exist in reality, right? It's the sort of thing that, like, I don't know, is, right? The sorts of things that you can say exist. But what is it to exist in the understanding? Well, it's something like being an idea, right? If you have the idea of God, then God exists in the understanding, right? And there's this question then whether God exists in reality, right? Whether or not the idea sort of picks anything out. Okay, so for Anselm, some things exist in reality, like tables, chairs, and some things God exists in reality. Some things exist in the understanding, like, I don't know, Pegasus, right? There's an idea of Pegasus, but you can't like spill your coffee on Pegasus or ride Pegasus. And finally, some things exist in both reality and in the understanding, right? Like tables, chairs, me, you. Oh, quick aside, can you think of something that exists in reality but not in the understanding? Well, you can't sort of point to anything, right, or say anything here because it would exist in the understanding then, right? You'd have the idea of it. But presumably there are things that exist in reality, but in no one's understanding, at least according to Anselm, right? Things that we just don't know about. Okay, so luckily for our purposes, the passage continues, right? And Anselm's going to draw this distinction more clearly between things that exist in the understanding and things that exist in reality, right? Or what it is to exist in the understanding on the one hand, and what it is to exist in reality on the other. Right, and he knows that these are different things, right? So it's one thing for an object to be in the understanding, that is to exist in the understanding, and another to understand that the object exists in reality. Right, so on the one hand, we have things that exist in the understanding. On the other, we have things that exist in reality. Okay, so he's going to tell us what this distinction means, or how to understand this distinction, or give us an example of this distinction in action. Okay, so Anselm's way of explaining the difference involves a painter. The painter's idea of a painting, and the painting the painter paints. So Anselm tells us, when a painter first conceives of what he will afterwards perform, that is, paint, he has it in his understanding, right? He has an idea of it. But he does not yet understand it to be, that is, to exist in reality, because he has not yet performed it. That is, he hasn't painted it, right? So we're imagining this painter, he has an idea for a painting, and she just hasn't, like, put, brush to canvas, right? She hasn't painted the painting yet. But after she's made the painting, she both has it in her understanding and she understands that it exists because she's made it, right? She's painted it. Okay, so before the painter paints the painting, she has the idea of the painting in her head, right? She thinks, oh, I want to put this onto canvas. Okay, she then paints it, right? And now the painting exists in reality. It's no longer just an idea, right? It's been made concrete. Okay, so So we started off with the idea that Anselm thinks God exists, and he wonders whether that's correct, right? Because there are people who disagree with him. Okay. He draws this distinction between existing in reality and existing in the understanding, right? And he explains what that distinction means. Okay, now he's going to use that distinction. So he says, hence, even the fool is convinced that something exists in the understanding, at least that from which nothing greater can be conceived. For when he hears of this, he understands it, and whatever is understood exists in the understanding. Okay, so Anselm thinks that the fool, that is the atheist, should admit that God, that is the greatest conceivable being, exists in the understanding. Why? Try to answer that question. Pause the video. Okay, so Anselm thinks that whatever is understood exists in the understanding. Right? So why should the atheist say that God, the GCB, exists in the understanding? Well, because whatever is understood exists in the understanding, right? And the fool grants that God exists in the understanding. Right? The fool doesn't say, I don't understand the concept of God. Right? The fool, according to Anselm, says, oh, I understand what the concept means. I just don't think it picks anything out. Right? But if the fool, the atheist, grants that, then by this principle that's highlighted, whatever is understood exists in the understanding, the greatest conceivable being exists in the understanding. Okay. So Anselm's going to use that, the claim that the greatest conceivable being exists in the understanding, and that the atheist is committed to this, argue that the greatest conceivable being must exist in reality if it exists in the understanding. Okay, so how's that going to work? So here's the long passage. And assuredly that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. For suppose it exists in the understanding alone, then it can be conceived to exist in reality, which is greater. Therefore, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, that very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater being can be conceived. But obviously this is impossible. Hence there's no doubt that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality. Okay, so this is the argument for the existence of God. And it might feel that a very big rabbit has been pulled out of a very small hat. So let's try to unpack what's going on here. Okay, so remember that Anselm is arguing that God exists. Right? Specifically, he's going to argue that for this highlighted claim, and assuredly that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. That is, it has to exist in reality if it exists in the understanding. Right? So this is the claim that Anselm's going to argue for. So the rest of this passage is an argument for that claim. Okay, note how this claim highlighted in the beginning returns at the end. There's no doubt that there exists a being in which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality. Right? So he starts this part of the passage by telling us what he's going to argue for, and he concludes with a statement of what it is that he argued for, right? Namely, that there's no doubt that there exists a being in which nothing greater can be conceived, that exists both in the understanding and in reality. Okay. So let's look at the passage again. So I'll start with 4 just before the highlighted part. So 4, suppose it, the greatest conceivable being, exists in the understanding alone. Right? Suppose that the greatest conceivable being just exists in the understanding. Then, Anselm says, it can be conceived to exist in reality, which is greater. So here's our assumption. Let's suppose or assume that the greatest conceivable being exists only in the understanding. Right? Anselm thinks that we could conceive of something just like that not only exists in the understanding, but exists in reality, and that it would be greater if it existed in reality. Right? So let's leave the greater question aside for now. Right? Think about an idea of a painting. Right? We could conceive of the painting, that idea being made concrete, that is, existing not only in the understanding as an idea, but in reality as a painting. Similarly, Anselm thinks we could conceive of the greatest conceivable conceivable being, the concept existing not only in the understanding, right, but in reality as well. Okay. So this is our assumption, right? Suppose that the greatest conceivable being exists in the understanding alone. On that assumption, right, it can be conceived to exist in reality, right? This is the idea of the painting in the painting. And Anselm thinks that it would be greater if the greatest conceivable being existed in reality rather than only in the understanding. Right? So Anselm seems to think that if the greatest conceivable being exists only in the understanding, then we can conceive of it existing in reality as well, and that this would be greater. Right? This would be a greater thing. Okay, but why? Right? Why would it be greater if the greatest conceivable being existed in reality, not only in the understanding? Well, here's a sort of fun way to sort of maybe think about what Anselm has in mind here. Would you rather have $10 that you imagine or an actual crisp $10 bill? Which would be better? Well, presumably you want the money, not just the idea. Right? It would be better if that $10 actually existed and you had it than if it was merely like the idea of $10. Right? The idea of $10 won't buy you anything, but a $10 bill might buy you something that you want. Right, so Anselm thinks in general that existence in reality is greater than existence merely in the understanding. Right? For certain things, it's better that they exist in reality than merely in the understanding. Existence is what's sometimes called a perfection, according to Anselm. Right, so remember, we could imagine the idea of a painting, right? And we could imagine that idea being made concrete and existing in reality. Similarly, we can imagine that the GCB exists only in the understanding, and we can imagine a being just like that exists both in the understanding and in reality. Right? And Anselm thinks that the latter is greater than the former. That is, the greatest conceivable being or the thing like it that exists both in reality and in the understanding is greater than that being that exists only in the understanding. Right? And it's for this reason that Anselm thinks that the greatest conceivable being can't exist in the understanding alone. Okay, why? And here's where he tells us, right? If that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived. Right? So on the one hand, we have the greatest conceivable being, the GCB that exists only in the understanding. On the other, we have something just like it that exists not only in the understanding, but also in reality. Okay, which is better? Anselm thinks it's the latter, the thing that exists both in the understanding and in reality. Okay. Now think about what the GCB is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the greatest conceivable being. Nothing you can imagine could be better than it. Okay, so now imagine that the greatest conceivable being exists only in the understanding. Right? Anselm thinks that we could imagine something that would be greater than it. In which case, the greatest conceivable being, the thing that exists only in the understanding by assumption, wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being. Right? Something could be conceived that would be greater than it. Namely, something just like it that exists not only in the understanding, but also in reality. Okay, so Anselm thinks that the assumption that the greatest conceivable being exists only in the understanding leads to an impossibility, right? He says, obviously this is impossible. Okay, what exactly is the impossibility? Okay, pause the video and try to figure that out. Write it down. Okay, so what's supposed to be impossible here, right, is that the greatest conceivable being isn't the greatest conceivable being, right? If the greatest conceivable being exists only in the understanding, right? It wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being. So here's the passage again. If that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived, right? Again, the greatest conceivable being that exists only in the understanding compared to the greatest conceivable being that exists only in the understanding and in reality, right? If the GCB exists only in the understanding, it's not the greatest conceivable being, but it's supposed to be the greatest conceivable being by hypothesis. So now we have, oh, a contradiction. That's the impossibility. Right. So Anselm concludes by rejecting the assumption that the greatest conceivable being exists in the understanding alone. Right. Suppose it existed in the understanding alone. Well, a contradiction follows from this. Namely, it would be the greatest conceivable being and not the greatest conceivable being. So he concludes, hence, there's no doubt that there exists a being in which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality. Okay, so what's sort of neat about this argument is that it appears that Anselm grants his opponent's assumption that the GCB exists in the understanding alone, and shows that the view is incoherent. Right? It apparently leads to the contradiction that the GCB is not the GCB. That is, Anselm says, sure, let's suppose that the GCB exists only in the understanding. Right? And then he shows that this leads to the contradiction that the GCB is not the GCB, and then he rejects the assumption. Right? The assumption being that the GCB exists only in the understanding, right? So he concludes the GCB exists not only in the understanding, but also in reality. Okay, so one broad structural feature of this argument should be familiar. Think back to the Barber paradox. Right? That was an argument. What type of argument was that? Okay, so I imagine that you all said reductio ad absurdum, right? So an argument that begins with an assumption, shows that a contradiction follows from the assumption, and then rejects the assumption. So here we have an assumption, the GCB exists only in the understanding. We show that it leads to a contradiction, right? And we reject the assumption that with which we began, right? So these two arguments similar in this sort of way. So that's why we were talking about the Barber paradox last time. So here are the two arguments, right? I'm going to call attention to some features of them. So first, on the one hand, we have the Barber paradox. This is P1 through P4 in conclusion C. Suppose that there's a barber who shaves all and only those people who do not shave themselves. Premise 2, if the barber shaves himself, then he doesn't shave himself. Premise 3, if the barber doesn't shave himself, then he does shave himself. Premise 4, nothing both shaves and doesn't shave himself. Conclusion, there's no barber who shaves all and only those people who do not shave themselves. That is, our first premise, our assumption, is false. Okay, so that's the Barber paradox. On the other hand, we have Anselm's ontological argument. And here's how I've reconstructed it. Premise 1 prime, suppose that the GCB exists only in the understanding. Premise 2 prime, if the GCB exists in the understanding, then it can be conceived to exist in reality as well. Premise 3 prime, existence in reality is greater than existence merely in the understanding. Premise 4 prime, the thing that is like the GCB but exists in reality in addition would be greater than the GCB. Right, premise 5, here's our contradiction. The GCB would not be the GCB on the assumption that the GCB exists only in the understanding. So we conclude C prime with the GCB exists in the understanding and in reality, that is, premise 1 prime is false. Okay, so both arguments are similar in the following way, right? Both begin with our reductio assumption, namely the thing that we're going to assume to derive a contradiction and ultimately reject. Both of them have some intermediate steps rather, in which we derive a contradiction from the assumption. Both give us a contradiction, right? And both conclude with a rejection of our reductio assumption, P1 and P1 prime. Right? Both arguments begin by assuming something. They show that the assumption leads to a contradiction. They conclude by rejecting the assumption. So both arguments are reductio ad absurdum arguments. So here's a question to think about. Right. So here's the argument again. What do you think about it? Did Anselm prove that God exists? Well, so this is something I want you to talk about on the discussion board. But this was quite long. Hopefully it's giving you some stuff to think about. Take some time, go back, think about it, and I'll see you in the next video.